there still remains significant gaps between where the U.S. is and where the rest of the world is, but we're moving closer and closer to their direction. And I think really feel very, very strongly that Rafah invasion cannot go forward. And we'll increasingly use whatever leverage we can to make that clear to the Israelis.
The US has warned that an Israeli military operation in Rafah would be a disaster if no plan is made to protect more than 1 million Palestinian civilians trapped in the city. Israel's Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu says he will not bow to pressure from Washington to postpone an attack on the city in southern Gaza, where many civilians have sought refuge from the war that began with the Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel on October the 7th. The US National Security spokesman John Kirby said he believes Israel is heeding the warnings of a potential humanitarian disaster.
We have seen them take actions, sometimes actions that even I'm not sure our own military would take, in terms of informing civilian populations ahead of operations, where to go, where not to go. They have taken steps. Now, obviously, those steps, while noteworthy, haven't been enough to reduce the civilian casualties, which is why the president spoke so forthrightly about it yesterday, and why we're going to continue to do everything we can to press the Israelis to be more careful.
Well, the US has vetoed an Algerian resolution at the United Nations demanding an immediate ceasefire in Gaza, but it has proposed its own draft urging a temporary ceasefire as soon as practicable and on the condition that all hostages are released. It also calls for barriers to humanitarian aid reaching Gaza to be lifted. Well, Frank Lowenstein is a former US Special Envoy for Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. He's also a former US Special Envoy for the Middle East, and we can speak to him now. Good evening to you, Frank.
Hi, how are you?
I'm very well. Really good to have you with us tonight. What do you make of the US stance here on Israel, saying that it would be a disaster if Israel goes ahead with an offensive in Rafah without a plan to protect civilians?
Well, I think it's pretty significant because I don't think there's any such thing as a plan to protect civilians in Rafah. There's nowhere to put 1,500,000 people and really no way to get them there. So, in effect, in between the lines, we are saying we strongly oppose this Rafah invasion. And the reason why is because we really want to focus on getting a ceasefire in place that will allow more humanitarian assistance in and give us an opportunity to negotiate for an additional a period of ceasefire and then hopefully the end of the war. So we really opposed what the Israelis wanted us to do at the UN here today. And I know it seems like it's very small potatoes to a lot of people, but it's fairly significant given where Biden has been.
There's so many different aspects to this. First of all, John Kirby, the US National Security spokesman, seemed to be saying, oh, yes, Israel is heeding these warnings. But Benjamin Netanyahu keeps insisting he is going to continue the offensive in Gaza until Hamas is destroyed. And only 24 hours or so ago, we heard Benny Gantz, who's a senior figure in the war cabinet, issuing this ultimatum saying that unless the hostages are released by the 10th of March, that offensive into Rafah will go ahead.
Yeah, and I think we're increasingly frustrated with the Israelis and their willingness to publicly defy us on this stuff. I think the UN resolution that we put forward today was a shot across the bow of the Israelis to let them know that if they continue to carry on down the path they're on right now against our best advice, that they can expect that we're going to get tougher and tougher on them at the UN. So yeah, we'll see if we follow through on that. But I think we're increasingly at odds with the Israelis and increasingly willing to let that be known publicly.
Interesting. So you believe that this language of this UN draft put down by the United States, talking about a ceasefire as soon as practicable and on the condition that all hostages are released. I mean, people listening to this, and there's a big debate here in the UK about the language from both the government and the opposition on a ceasefire, will wonder whether this is actually just giving Israel a huge amount of leeway. I mean, how do you read the wording of that US draft motion?
Well, first of all, I think it's significant that the Biden administration was willing to put ceasefire into blue at the UN. That's something that we have not been willing to do previously, and I think it's something the Israelis would not be happy about. But the bigger message in my mind was on Rafah, because I think our willingness to confront them publicly on that, to say, in the context of the United Nations, that we strongly oppose that, I think that's a pretty significant step forward for Biden in terms of being willing to distance himself from the Israelis. And I think that's a function of two things. Obviously, we're very isolated internationally. The Russians and the Chinese couldn't have been happier with the outcome today. And the president has some issues politically in the United States, particularly with the Arab American community. And I think he's trying to move in their direction more than he has been in the past. And I think this is a first step.
Is this US resolution going to actually be put to the United Nations, going to be voted on anytime soon?
From what I understand in New York, it's going to be a very, very difficult to get anybody on board with that. I don't think the Russians and the Chinese are in any mood to let us off the hook for the isolation that we're in right now. So I would be sort of surprised if that wound up getting any traction. They've already said it won't be this week. So again, I think it's more of a signal to the Israelis that we're willing to use the UN as a forum to put pressure on them, particularly around the ceasefire and around the Rafah invasion than we've been willing to do in the past. But yeah, I wouldn't put a whole lot of stock in this particular resolution passing.
How important do you think it is that other allies like the UK do send out a similar signal to the one which the US is putting out? We've got the opposition Labour Party, which, as I'm sure you know, could well be forming the next government here in the UK, putting down a motion in the Commons tomorrow calling for an immediate humanitarian ceasefire. Now, the full motion does also call on Hamas to abide by it as well as Israel. Do you think that that is significant?
Yes, I think it all adds up in the consciousness of the Biden administration to the really, really clear message that we're in an untenable position with respect to where the rest of the world is, and honestly, with respect to where a lot of the American public is. So I think that you'll increasingly see us getting tougher and tougher with the Israelis publicly and at the UN. Again, we don't support a permanent ceasefire to the war, and that's where I think any effort we had to get the Algerians on board with what we were willing to support foundered, because obviously they want a permanent and full ceasefire. We want a temporary ceasefire and then hope to build on that from there. So that there still remains significant gaps between where the U.S. is and where the rest of the world is, but we're moving closer and closer to their direction. And I think really feel very, very strongly that Rafah invasion cannot go forward, and we'll increasingly use whatever leverage we can to make that clear to the Israelis.
Well, splashed all over the papers here in the UK is the intervention from the Prince of Wales, Prince William, of course, the future king, saying that he thinks that he's very concerned about the terrible human cost of the conflict. Too many people have been killed. I, like so many others, want to see an end to the fighting as soon as possible. And he talks about the desperate need for increased humanitarian support to Gaza. Do you think it does make a difference when you have the future king setting out his views like that?
Yeah, I do. I mean, obviously, it's not a major development in terms of formation of U.S. policy, but I think it adds to the increasing chorus and to the growing international consensus that this war is exacting an appalling cost on Palestinian civilians and really has to stop. Again, I think Biden will lag behind the rest of the world on that, but he's no longer willing to just do exactly what the Israelis ask, which is, it's a small step, but it's progress in any event.
Where are the Republicans on this stance, which President Biden is taking now? I mean, we know that um, also held up in this huge package of aid for Ukraine is military funding for Israel. That still seems to be being held up by some Republicans in the House of Representatives. Do you think that the Republicans, and if we do get a future President Trump, there will be a different approach to the war in Gaza if, of course, as we hope it's not, that the war in Gaza were still to be going on?
Yeah, I think if President Trump is in office, we won't do anything to check the Israelis in any way, form, or fashion. I think we'll just lean in on supporting them in whatever they want to do. I think Republicans right now have been fairly quiet on any light pressure we've been putting on the Israelis. That may change if that pressure gets stronger. I think the Israelis have the ability to mobilize allies in Congress to push back on Biden. But I think the Biden guys are ready for that. And it's not as if there's a massive groundswell of opposition to Biden's position coming up from the right. In fact, we really got involved when the Iranian militias issue came up. They really, the right wing in America is really hard over on Iran. They're less so concerned about whether Biden's putting some reins on the Israelis.
President Biden, of course, now does appear to be taking this increasingly tougher language when he addresses all of this. I mean, is there a sense here in which the Biden administration is looking at Netanyahu's vulnerable position? He's got this coalition there. But of course, there is quite a bit of opposition to his leadership, even within Israel. Is there any sense, do you think, in which President Biden is perhaps hoping that if the US sends out this signal, then that could increase the domestic pressure that there is on Netanyahu?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And my sense is that the Israeli public is more or less aligned with Netanyahu in terms of the desire to destroy Hamas. I think he's playing to his own politics back home when he keeps reiterating that message. And I think he's speaking to a broadly supported population that I know we're seeing, hostage families, lobbying for a ceasefire and that sort of thing. But I don't think that really represents where the majority of the Israeli public is. I think what you're seeing from Biden is more a reaction to our own politics here in the United States. He's got a real problem with the Arab American community in some absolutely critical states for his reelection campaign. And just on that, very briefly, I don't think it's coincidental that Biden came out with a very strong statement saying Israel's reaction was over the top. Too many innocent people were dying and starving, and it had to stop. That came the day after a senior team went out to Michigan and spoke to some of the voters there. So I think the shifting political alignments in the United States are starting to really weigh much more heavily on President Biden.
So that is, you're saying, a real concern that President Biden might be losing the support of the Arab community. Is he not worried, though, that he might be losing some Jewish votes if he appears to be too robust in his stance against Netanyahu?
Well, sure, it's always a balancing act, and I think traditionally for people like Biden that worked in the United States Congress for a long period of time, there's a visceral instinct to side with the Israelis if you're concerned about the politics. But I think the politics in America have shifted on that. I think from an electoral college perspective, they have much more to fear from an Arab American community in Michigan that could potentially swing the outcome of the entire election than they are about the right wing vote in America or the Jewish community vote or anything. I think that the balance of power has shifted to the young people and to the Arab community, which is really strongly opposed to this war. So I think you're seeing that reflected in some of Biden's comments.
Yeah, fascinating how the domestic politics is playing into all of this, as it is here in the UK. Just one final point. Obviously, at the moment, we are such a very long way away from any kind of meaningful negotiations about a future political settlement. But we have had the British Foreign Secretary, Lord Cameron, talking about the UK still wanting to see a two-state solution, and indeed talking about how recognition of a Palestinian state would not have to wait until the end of a process, that there could be some form of early recognition of a Palestinian state as part of those wider negotiations. As somebody who's been involved in those negotiations where we did have proper negotiations underway, what do you make of Lord Cameron's intervention on this?
Well, I think it's something that the United States would consider recognition of Palestine in the context of a deal that involved Saudi normalization of relations with Israel, a plan to reconstruct Gaza, a path to a two-state solution. I just don't think we're going to see any of that actually happen. I don't think there's any willingness on the Israeli side to talk about a two-state solution right now. I think the Biden administration is getting a lot of inputs from the Arab world in particular, and obviously from some of the Europeans about the two-state solution. I think we'd really like to go down that path if we could. But right now, it's really dead on arrival in Israel. I don't think there's really anybody in Israel who wants to talk about a two-state solution right now. That's not just Netanyahu, that's the whole country. So the idea of putting forth that kind of a plan when you know the Israelis would reject it, at the outset, I just don't know whether that makes a whole lot of sense for us.
Frank Lowenstein, former US Special Envoy to the Middle East. Really interesting to talk to you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.